Within the administrative heart of imperial China, the complex known as the Forbidden City functioned not only as a residence of emperors, but as a tightly regulated system of governance, ritual, and control. Constructed during the early 15th century under the Yongle Emperor, the palace became the political center of successive dynasties, most notably the Ming and Qing. Yet beyond its monumental architecture and ceremonial grandeur, surviving palace records reveal a highly structured internal world, governed by detailed regulations that shaped every aspect of life within its walls. Historical records indicate that the Forbidden City operated through an intricate bureaucracy that extended far beyond state administration into the personal lives of those who resided there. Palace memorials, internal regulations, and court diaries suggest that thousands of individuals, eunuchs, consorts, servants, guards, and officials, were bound within a rigid hierarchy. Movement, speech, diet, and even sleep were subject to oversight. The emperor stood at the apex, but his authority was mediated through systems designed to maintain order and prevent instability within a confined and politically sensitive environment. Contemporary accounts describe the palace as a self-contained city, where entry and exit were tightly controlled. Registers of personnel were meticulously maintained. Eunuchs, who formed a critical administrative class within the inner court, were subject to strict supervision. Surviving documents from the Ming period suggest that eunuchs were assigned specific roles, ranging from managing imperial workshops to overseeing communication between the inner and outer courts. Their influence could be significant, yet legal codes of the period reveal persistent attempts by officials to limit their power, reflecting an ongoing tension within the governance structure. The daily routines of palace inhabitants were governed by timekeeping systems that synchronized activities across the complex. Records from the Qing dynasty indicate that bells and drums marked the passage of time, dictating when gates would open, when officials could submit memorials, and when court rituals would occur. These rhythms imposed a collective discipline, reinforcing the hierarchical order that defined palace life. Even the emperor's schedule, though theoretically autonomous, was shaped by ritual obligations recorded in court calendars. Surviving documents suggest that food distribution within the palace was another mechanism of control and organization. Detailed inventories recorded the allocation of grain, meat, and luxury items to different ranks within the hierarchy. The imperial kitchen system was vast, employing hundreds of workers to prepare meals according to strict dietary codes. These codes reflected not only nutritional considerations, but also symbolic hierarchies. Certain dishes were reserved exclusively for the emperor, while others were distributed according to rank and favor. Deviations from these norms could carry administrative consequences. Chroniclers noted that the inner court, where imperial consorts resided, operated under an especially rigid set of regulations. Palace archives from the Qing period reveal a carefully managed system governing the selection, promotion, and discipline of consorts. Women within the harem were organized into ranks, each associated with specific privileges and restrictions. Their movements were limited, and communication with the outside world was heavily restricted. Records of disciplinary actions indicate that breaches of protocol, such as unauthorized movement or improper conduct, were addressed through formal procedures, underscoring the controlled nature of their environment. Health and medicine within the palace were also subject to bureaucratic oversight. Medical records indicate that physicians were assigned to the court, maintaining detailed logs of treatments administered to the emperor and other high-ranking individuals. These records suggest a combination of traditional medical practices and ritual considerations. The health of the emperor was a matter of state importance, and physicians operated under the constant scrutiny of court officials. Failures in treatment could result in severe punishment, reflecting the high stakes associated with their role. The architectural design of the Forbidden City itself reinforced the mechanisms of control documented in palace records. Gates, courtyards, and corridors were arranged to regulate movement and visibility. Access to certain areas was restricted based on rank, and guards were stationed at key to enforce these boundaries. Surviving plans and administrative documents suggest that spatial organization was integral to maintaining order, ensuring that interactions between different groups were carefully managed. Financial records from the palace provide further insight into the scale and complexity of its operations. Budgets were allocated for maintenance, ceremonies, and personnel, with detailed accounts tracking expenditures. These records indicate that the palace was not only epicenter but also an requiring constant resource management. Corruption and mismanagement were recurring concerns, as evidenced by audits and disciplinary actions recorded in official documents. The relationship between the inner court and the outer active apparatus was mediated through formal channels documented in palace archives. Memorials submitted by officials were processed through with eunuchs often acting as intermediaries. This system allowed the emperor to maintain control over state affairs while remaining physically and symbolically separated from the world. However, historical records suggest that this separation could also lead to information bottlenecks, influencing decision-making processes. Periods of crisis provide particularly revealing insights into the functioning of the palace system. During times of instability or external threat, palace records indicate adjustments in security measures and active procedures. Increased surveillance, restrictions on movement, and intensified scrutiny of personnel were common responses. These measures reflect the nature of the palace as both a seat of power and a potential of vulnerability. The Ming dynasty and the subsequent establishment of Qing rule brought changes to the administration of the Forbidden City, yet many underlying structures remained intact. Qing records suggest a continuation of established practices, alongside adaptations reflecting the ruling elite. The incorporation of Manchu traditions into court rituals and Asian illustrates the flexibility of the system, even as it maintained its core hierarchical principles. Personal writings from individuals associated with the court, including diaries and unofficial accounts, provide additional perspectives on daily life within the palace. While these sources must be approached with caution, they often corroborate the structured environment depicted in official records. Descriptions of routine and the constant presence of surveillance align with the administrative framework outlined in formal documents. The eventual decline of the imperial system in the early 20th century led to the dissolution of many of these structures. However, the surviving records of the Forbidden City continue to offer a detailed account of how power was organized and maintained within one of the most controlled environments in pre-modern history. They reveal a system in which governance extended into every aspect of life, where hierarchy was reinforced through both visible and invisible mechanisms, and where the experience of individuals was shaped by the demands of an enduring imperial order. These documents do not present a dramatic narrative, but rather a consistent pattern of regulation, adaptation, and through them, the Forbidden City emerges not only as a symbol of imperial authority, but as a system sustained by rules, records, and the oversight of those who lived and worked within its walls. Surviving documents from the later Qing period indicate that, despite the appearance of continuity, the internal balance of authority within the Forbidden City remained subject to constant negotiation. Memorials and court records suggest that the emperor's theoretical supremacy often depended on the efficiency and reliability of intermediaries who translated imperial intent into administrative action. These intermediaries, particularly eunuchs and senior, operated within overlapping jurisdictions that could both reinforce and complicate governance. Historical records indicate that communication inside the palace followed a highly codified system designed to prevent unauthorized influence. Written memorials, often composed in formalized language, passed through designated channels before reaching the throne. Once reviewed, imperial responses were documented, copied, and redistributed according to rank and function. This process created an official record of decision-making, but it also introduced opportunities for delay or selective transmission. Surviving case records suggest that disputes occasionally arose over the interpretation or implementation of imperial directives, highlighting the limits of centralized control in practice. The role of eunuchs, in particular, reflects the complexities of palace administration. While legal codes repeatedly emphasized restrictions on their involvement, palace archives reveal that eunuchs frequently handled sensitive logistical and communicative tasks. Their proximity to the emperor allowed them to shape the flow of information, even when formal authority rested elsewhere. Chroniclers noted periodic efforts by scholar officials to curtail eunuch influence, often through policy reforms or disciplinary campaigns. These efforts, however, appear to have achieved only partial success, as the structural reliance on eunuchs remained embedded in the system. Within the inner court, records concerning imperial consorts provide insight into another layer of controlled hierarchy. The ranking system governing these women was not static. Promotions and demotions were recorded in detailed registers, often linked to factors such as childbirth, favor, or adherence to protocol. Surviving edicts suggest that the emperor exercised discretion in these decisions, yet the framework within which such discretion operated was highly formalized. Ritual obligations, including participation in ceremonies and observance of mourning periods, were documented with precision, reinforcing the integration of personal life into the broader political order. Economic documentation from the palace further illustrates the scale of administrative oversight. Inventories of textiles, ceramics, and other goods produced within imperial workshops were maintained with considerable detail. These workshops, located within or adjacent to the palace complex, supplied items for both use and ceremonial display. Records indicate that production quotas were established and quality control was enforced through inspection systems. Failures to meet standards could result in penalties, suggesting that even skilled artisans operated under strict accountability. The management of labor within the palace extended beyond skilled production to include routine maintenance and roles. Registers list the of assigned to specific tasks, from courtyards to maintaining water systems. These records suggest with responsibilities clearly delineated to minimize overlap and ensure efficiency. At the same time, the reliance on a large, resident workforce created ongoing challenges related to discipline and supervision. Archival material includes references to infractions such as theft, negligence, and of curfew regulations, each addressed through established disciplinary procedures. Security arrangements within the Forbidden City were similarly detailed. Guard rosters, patrol schedules, and gate logs were recorded systematically, reflecting the importance of controlling access to the imperial residence. Historical records indicate that the palace was divided into zones, each with its own of restriction. Entry into more sensitive areas required authorization, often documented through physical tokens or written permits. These measures were designed not only to protect the emperor, but also to maintain the separation between different groups of the palace. Periods of heightened tension reveal how these systems could be intensified. During succession disputes or external threats, palace records suggest additional guards were deployed, and restrictions on movement became more stringent. Communication channels were monitored more closely, and the activities of both eunuchs and officials were subject to increased scrutiny. These reflect a culture that prioritized stability and continuity, even under conditions of uncertainty. Medical and health records from the Qing court provide further evidence of the intersection between personal and administrative control. Physicians maintained logs detailing symptoms, diagnoses, and treatments, particularly for the emperor and senior members of the court. These records indicate a reliance on established medical, combined with ritual considerations. The accountability of court physicians was formalized. Errors in diagnosis or treatment could lead to investigation and punishment, underscoring the broader principle that all roles within the palace were subject to oversight. Education and intellectual life within the palace were also structured through formal systems. Tutors assigned to imperial heirs followed prescribed curricula, documented in educational records that outline the study of classical texts, history, and governance. These records suggest that the training of future rulers was treated as a matter of state, with progress monitored and reported to senior officials. The emphasis on Confucian learning reflects the ideological foundation of the imperial system, reinforcing values of hierarchy, duty, and moral conduct. The symbolic dimension of palace life, while often associated with ceremony, also functioned as aid. Ritual manuals and ceremonial records detail the precise of events, the roles of participants, and the spatial organization of ceremonies. These documents indicate that ritual was not merely performative, but served to reinforce the legitimacy of and the court. Participation in these rituals was both a privilege and an obligation, further integrating individuals into the hierarchical structure. As the 19th century progressed, external pressures began to affect the internal functioning of the palace. Records from this period reflect increasing financial strain, as resources were diverted to address military challenges and demands. Budgetary documents indicate efforts to reduce expenditures within the palace, including adjustments to allowances and certain activities. These measures suggest that the administrative of the Forbidden City was not isolated from broader dynamics, but was directly influenced by them. The presence of foreign envoys and the gradual expansion of diplomatic introduced additional complexities. Protocol records document the handling of these interactions, including the management of access to the palace and the of audiences. These encounters required adaptations to established procedures, as the court sought to maintain its traditional hierarchy while engaging with external powers operating under different norms. By the late Qing period, surviving documents increasingly reflect under strain. Reports of corruption, inefficiency, and administrative delay appear with greater frequency, indicating challenges in maintaining the control that had characterized earlier periods. Efforts at reform, including attempts to modernize certain aspects of governance, are documented but often appear limited in scope. The persistence of entrenched practices, combined with external, contributed to a gradual erosion of institutional effectiveness. Even within this context of change, the fundamental principles underlying palace administration remained visible in the records. Hierarchy and the of daily life continued to define the experience of the Forbidden City. The detailed documentation of these systems provides a rare insight into how an imperial court sought to sustain authority through a combination of regulation and adaptation over several centuries. By the final decades of imperial rule, administrative records from the Forbidden City increasingly reflect a governing system attempting to preserve continuity under conditions of accelerating disruption. Surviving court documents from the late Qing period indicate that ceremonial precision remained formally intact, even as the administrative mechanisms supporting it became more strained. Ritual schedules were still maintained, but annotations in palace logs suggest frequent delays, adjustments, and reliance on abbreviated procedures to accommodate financial and logistical pressures. Historical records indicate that the imperial household's internal economy faced sustained constraints. Budget ledgers reveal reductions in allocations for maintenance, staffing, and ceremonial provisions. These reductions were not uniform, but instead applied selectively across departments, suggesting attempts to prioritize core functions of governance and ritual presentation. Workshop records from imperial production units showed decreased output in certain categories of luxury goods, while essential maintenance tasks were preserved, albeit with fewer resources. This uneven contraction reflects a system attempting to balance symbolic authority with practical limitation. At the same time, documentation concerning personnel management reveals increasing administrative fatigue. Registers of eunuchs, guards, and service staff show more frequent turnover and irregular postings. Disciplinary records continue to document infractions such as neglect of duty or procedural violations, but the consistency of enforcement appears less uniform than in earlier periods. Chroniclers associated with court oversight offices noted growing difficulties in maintaining the strict separation of roles and jurisdictions that had previously structured palace governance. Communication between the inner court and external state institutions also became more complex. Memorial processing records indicate longer transmission times and increased reliance on intermediary offices. While the formal procedures remained unchanged, annotations in administrative logs suggest that delays became routine. This created a governance environment in which decision-making was still centralized in principle, but increasingly dependent on fragmented channels of execution. Foreign diplomatic interactions, documented in protocol archives, introduced further procedural adaptation. Records show that audiences and receptions required careful calibration of traditional court etiquette with the expectations of foreign representatives. These adjustments were managed through incremental revisions to protocol rather than comprehensive reform, reflecting the court's broader preference for continuity over structural transformation. Such records illustrate how the imperial system absorbed external pressures without fundamentally altering its internal logic, even as those pressures accumulated. Medical and welfare records from this period also reveal subtle but significant shifts. Court physicians continued to maintain detailed logs of treatments, yet the scale of available resources appears to have diminished. Supplies of certain medicinal materials were recorded as inconsistent, and procurement documents indicate delays in replenishment. Despite these constraints, the formal accountability of medical practitioners remained intact, with investigative procedures still recorded in cases of treatment failure. This persistence of oversight highlights the continued emphasis on responsibility even amid institutional strain. Education within the palace retained its formal structure, particularly in the instruction of imperial descendants. Curricula documented in teaching records continued to emphasize classical Confucian texts, governance principles, and moral philosophy. However, Annotations from tutors suggest irregular attendance and interruptions caused by broader political instability. The intended continuity of intellectual training thus existed alongside practical disruptions, reflecting the widening gap between institutional design and operational reality. Security documentation from the late imperial period shows increased attention to internal stability. Gate logs and patrol schedules indicate heightened vigilance, particularly during periods of political uncertainty. However, comparative analysis of records suggests that enforcement consistency varied across different zones of the palace. While certain areas maintained strict oversight, others exhibited procedural lapses, indicating uneven administrative capacity. This fragmentation of enforcement reflects broader systemic pressures affecting all levels of palace governance. The early 20th century brought a decisive transformation in the political environment surrounding the palace. Historical accounts and official proclamations from the final years of imperial rule indicate that the authority of the throne had become largely symbolic, even as the administrative structure of the palace remained formally operational. Internal records from this period continue to document routine procedures, yet they increasingly exist alongside external events that the palace system could no longer fully regulate or contain. The formal end of imperial rule in 1912 marked the dissolution of the political system that had sustained the palace for centuries. Yet records from the immediate post-imperial period indicate that many internal structures persisted temporarily under revised conditions. Personnel registers, maintenance logs, and property inventories continued to be updated, reflecting an attempt to preserve order during transition. This continuity underscores the resilience of bureaucratic systems even after the collapse of their governing authority. In the years that followed, the transformation of the palace from an active seat of power to a historical site introduced a new phase in its documented existence. Administrative records gradually shifted focus from governance to preservation. Inventories became concerned with conservation of artifacts, architectural integrity, and historical classification. This transition reflects a broader redefinition of the palace's role, from functioning center of authority to curated cultural and historical repository. Taken together, the surviving palace records present a detailed portrait of an institution defined by structure, hierarchy, and procedural discipline. They reveal a system that operated for centuries through carefully maintained documentation, regulated access, and formalized roles. Even in its final phase, when administrative capacity was visibly weakened, the underlying framework of control remained legible in the records themselves.